headlines from Mexico are growing darker by the day, and one attack has shaken both local communities and international observers. A brutal strike carried out by a cartel has left many questioning just how far its reach extends. And just before the dust could even settle, the U.S. launched a lethal strike of its own, wiping out cartel members in a show of force. Could this single attack mark the beginning of something far bigger? And what does it mean for Mexico, the U.S., and beyond? Join us as we explain how the Mexican cartel attack can change everything. On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump ordered the State Department to give Latin American drug cartels a new label: terrorist organizations. Among the organizations placed under Trump's heavy scrutiny is Tren de Aragua, a notorious Venezuelan gang known for its violence and chaos in the region. Even more striking is his targeting of the so-called Cartel of the Suns, a group allegedly controlled by Nicolas Maduro alongside senior Venezuelan officials, including figures drawn from the nation's powerful military and intelligence sectors. That decision set the stage for one of the boldest and most controversial moves of his presidency. It served as both a warning shot and a declaration of intent, signaling that his administration would frame its fight against drugs and organized crime with the same intensity as a war against terrorism. It was revealed that Trump had secretly signed a directive to the Pentagon, commanding the American military to step into what had always been considered the territory of law enforcement. According to insiders familiar with the directive, the move opened the door for the use of armed forces at sea and on foreign soil against drug groups accused of flooding the U.S. with fentanyl and other deadly substances. Trump is determined to strike directly at the heart of organizations he views as enemies of the American people. Military officials, under this new order, began quietly sketching out possible plans, exploring how troops, ships, and advanced weaponry could be deployed against powerful cartels operating far beyond America's borders. Yet beneath the bold decision were questions. Critics whispered about troubling legal dramas that stretched across the entire idea. Some wondered whether it would be classified as murder if American forces, acting outside of a congressionally authorized war, ended up killing civilians who posed no immediate threat. Others questioned whether the Pentagon and the State Department's legal teams had reached any concrete opinions or whether the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel had been asked to deliver a decisive ruling. The silence surrounding these concerns only deepened the sense of unease. Those who defended the move insisted that the cartels had already crossed the line into terrorism. Trump himself reportedly argued that drug traffickers were not just criminals, but enemies of the state, operating like shadow armies that destroyed lives with poison disguised as profit. His allies claimed that waiting for traditional law enforcement had only prolonged the suffering, while swift military action could cripple the trade before it tightened its grip further on American streets. Over the past 2 months, the United States military has quietly but decisively bolstered its presence in the Southern Caribbean. Additional naval vessels have been deployed, accompanied by thousands of Marines and sailors, creating a show of strength designed to rattle adversaries and reassure allies. That buildup of forces didn't remain just a show of strength for long. It quickly turned into action. Recently, the United States launched a fierce strike in the Southern Caribbean, destroying a vessel packed with drugs and leaving 11 alleged narco-terrorists dead. The military operation had been aimed at the Venezuelan gang known as Tren de Aragua. Trump made it clear that the boat had been navigating through international waters, supposedly carrying dangerous narcotics destined for American shores. This lethal strike was accompanied by grainy aerial footage, a video clip showing a motorboat tearing across restless, choppy waters before suddenly exploding into flames. While many watched in shock, Venezuela's communications minister, Freddy Yanez, fired back on social media. He claimed, without presenting evidence, that the video had been fabricated with artificial intelligence. However, the Reuters news agency quickly reported that its preliminary checks had found no signs of tampering, though its verification efforts were still ongoing. Meanwhile, Secretary of State Marco Rubio reinforced the claim in a post on X. He wrote that the American military had carried out a lethal strike in the Southern Caribbean against a drug vessel that had departed from Venezuela, allegedly operated by a designated narco-terrorist organization. Yet despite the declarations, one critical question remained unanswered. Exactly what kind of drugs had been on the destroyed vessel? Trump's administration had already turned up the heat on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, showering the nation with immense political and military pressure. Among these measures was an astonishing reward of $50 million for information that could lead to Maduro's capture on drug trafficking charges. The Venezuelan leader responded by vowing that his country would fight against any American attempt to intervene militarily, painting the standoff as a brewing storm between two hardened foes. Unsurprisingly, the Venezuelan government reacted with anger, portraying the United States deployments as nothing short of imperial provocation. Nicolas Maduro also vowed that if the United States launched an attack, he would declare what he described as a republic in arms. He went further, insisting that the naval movements represented the greatest threat witnessed on the continent in the last 100 years. The push, however, reminded people of the past, where blurred lines between military and police actions had sparked heated debates about constitutional boundaries. Many legal scholars suggested that the plan could provoke fierce clashes in courtrooms and in Congress. Was this truly defense of the homeland, or was it the beginning of a dangerous expansion of executive power? While Washington insiders wrestled with the implications of these secret decisions, across the border, another drama was unfolding, one that placed Mexico's business elite face-to-face with the very real consequences of America's shifting strategy. Mexican business leaders gathered at the American Chamber of Commerce to discuss a U.S. threat unrelated to tariffs. They were warned that any company tied to cartel-linked transactions could face U.S. sanctions or even terrorism charges. The danger was clear. Cartels were no longer just drug traffickers, but sprawling conglomerates with tentacles in multiple industries. That meant companies could unknowingly cross paths with cartel networks and face devastating consequences. This fear drew more and more business leaders to the Chamber's special sessions. They arrived early, carefully studying the detailed protocols being laid out for them. These guidelines largely focused on how to shield themselves from U.S. institutions like the Treasury Department were concentrated on. A senior chamber official, Pedro Casas Alatriste, confided that the level of fear among the business class was real. He explained that many executives worried about hypothetical situations, such as if one of their workers were kidnapped and the company was forced to negotiate in some way with organized crime. In such a moment, even an involuntary transaction could make them legally vulnerable. The chilling effect of Trump's aggressive posture was undeniable. He had succeeded in sending shockwaves through Mexico's business elite, making them feel cornered by circumstances they could hardly control. At the same time, his warnings rattled the broader political class, with his menacing promises of military action echoing across government offices and boardrooms alike. Yet behind the thunderous threats, there was a looming question. Would this approach actually succeed in bringing down the cartels, or was it more smoke than fire? The reality seemed far less hopeful. Analysts and experts pointed out that Trump's approach was not built on a detailed plan or long-term vision. Instead, it came across as a scattered mix of tactics that lacked coherence or depth. Some even argued that the pressure campaign could backfire, intensifying violence and instability rather than reducing it. By treating a deeply rooted and complex criminal ecosystem as if it were a problem to be bombed away, the U.S. risked worsening the very dangers it sought to eliminate. Mexico's cartels had thrived for decades, embedding themselves into the economy, society, and even politics. Taking them down required more than symbolic labels and heavy-handed threats. It demanded a multi-layered strategy, one that addressed corruption, poverty, weak institutions, and cross-border demand for drugs. Without that, Trump's fiery moves might do little more than frighten businessmen, while the cartels themselves continue to expand in the shadows. While Donald Trump has turned toward raw power tactics to break the cartel's backbone, he has, at the same time, been accused of slashing funds meant for American drug treatment programs. This imbalance could allow demand to keep rising, giving cartels the exact financial incentives they need to maintain or even grow their deadly empire. The storm of policy decisions does not stop there. Tariffs, sweeping deportations, and mounting friction with Mexico's government, especially concerning U.S. military action across the border, have cracked open new doors for cartels to expand their influence. To his credit, Trump has forced America to pay sharper attention to the cartel menace, their sprawling international reach, and the tragic addiction to fentanyl and other devastating drugs that grips American communities. He has also spotlighted the shadowy role of foreign adversaries, particularly China, in supporting this toxic trade. There is no denying that the danger is real, intense, and immediate. But the methods employed have raised as many concerns as they have solved. Current and former U.S. and Mexican policy and security officials voiced a shared perspective. They explained that Trump's decision to label cartels as terrorist organizations, while not a silver bullet, did give U.S. law enforcement and the military more legal tools to chase cartels and anyone connected to them. They admitted that this designation added some leverage. Yet the gap between rhetoric and results was hard to ignore. While officials spoke of progress, the strategies they leaned on revealed familiar risks. Deportations, for instance, raised a similarly troubling pattern. The Trump administration had claimed that many of the migrants expelled were cartel or gang members, and insisted it was simpler to deport them than prosecute them inside the United States. History, however, suggested otherwise. By deporting large numbers of people, the U.S. risked creating pools of fresh recruits abroad or even sparking the birth of new transnational networks. The case of MS-13 stood as a reminder that gang had transformed into a global menace after deported individuals established overseas branches. Even the State Department itself had admitted as much when it announced terror designations earlier in the year. Meanwhile, in Mexico itself, the presence of the cartels remained both visible and secretive. While they did not openly dominate the heavily policed sprawl of Mexico City, reminders of their influence could still be found. Towering billboards warned in stark letters that fentanyl kills, restaurants hinted at narco-gangster themes, and in certain neighborhoods, faded photographs of the disappeared clung to walls like haunting echoes of violence that had stretched on for decades. Among those who closely track the fragile U.S.-Mexico security relationship, many dismissed Donald Trump's crusade against the cartels as little more than a performance designed to captivate American voters. One former Mexican security official, speaking cautiously over a cappuccino, observed that the question of effectiveness mattered less to Trump than whether the effort looked convincing to his audience. After a pause, he admitted that perhaps Trump even believed his tactics would succeed, a thought he found even more troubling since it suggested genuine conviction in flawed strategies. Conversations like these were held under strict anonymity as the subject carried both political sensitivity and real physical risk. The cartels themselves stand in stark contrast to traditional terrorist organizations. They are not driven by ideology or political visions, but by the relentless pursuit of money. Over time, their operations have sprawled far beyond narcotics, extending into human trafficking, fuel theft, and even infiltration of legitimate markets. This diversification has allowed them to adapt with ruthless efficiency. Mexican businesses, aware of the cartel's shadowy presence, have responded by pouring resources into lawyers, security consultants, and experts in supply chain vetting. These defensive moves serve as shields, or at least as public signals, that they are attempting to distance themselves from cartel entanglements. Trump's crackdown has not ignored this financial motive. He has sanctioned actors ranging from Mexican banks to a flamboyant rapper accused of laundering money on behalf of the cartels. Yet here, too, contradictions emerge. While targeting some avenues of cartel finance, his administration simultaneously weakened rules surrounding cryptocurrency, a tool increasingly exploited by criminal groups to move their profits across borders. This mixed approach raised doubts about whether the strategy was truly coherent or merely reactive. Adding to the complexity is the ever-present gun factor. U.S. government studies have long shown that a significant share of firearms fueling cartel violence in Mexico come directly from the United States. Despite this, Trump and his allies pushed to loosen gun restrictions rather than strengthen them. Mexican officials, in exasperation, even suggested that American gun manufacturers should be charged with aiding terrorists. The irony was striking. While Mexican authorities deployed troops and tightened crackdowns, the flow of weapons from the north remained an open wound. Still, to say the cartels have felt no pressure would be inaccurate. Coordinated efforts on both sides of the border, from tighter patrols and drone surveillance to ferocious firefights between Mexican troops and cartel gunmen in Sinaloa, have resulted in many arrests. American operations, some of which began before Trump's presidency, secured remarkable detentions of cartel leaders, shaking the underworld and intensifying bloody infighting among rival factions. Reports of cartels running low on cash suggested that the squeeze was real, even if not decisive. Inside Mexico's government, however, unease persisted. Officials worried that cartel figures now in American custody might reveal damning details about corrupt politicians, a revelation that could ignite political scandals at home. Mexican analysts and former officials voiced concern that while the United States appeared eager to spotlight Mexican actors tied to the cartels, there was far less focus on the Americans who profited from or facilitated cartel operations. This imbalance created perverse incentives for cartels to deepen alliances with criminal networks inside the United States. That uneasy balance, however, may be starting to tip. Former U.S. law enforcement officials warned that it would not hold for long, pointing to a court case involving a terror-designated cartel that had already drawn in American citizens. The terrorism label, in theory, could even extend as far as ordinary drug users, meaning someone who unknowingly bought a product linked to the cartels might face terror-related charges. Yet prosecutors were unlikely to target such low-level offenders, choosing instead to focus on higher stakes. The cartels, however, were already proving their adaptability. Analysts revealed that they had begun shifting the way they transported narcotics, designing new methods to reduce detection by authorities. Their ambitions stretched far beyond America's borders, with operations expanding into distant markets where law enforcement scrutiny was weaker. There was also talk of a pivot towards substances less notorious than fentanyl, drugs that were harder to track and less studied. Even as deaths linked to fentanyl appeared to decline in the United States, the cartels looked ready to fill the gap with equally dangerous alternatives. Alongside narcotics, they continued to branch into other lucrative illegal trades, fuel theft being one of the fastest-growing examples. These moves painted a picture of a network that thrived in uncertainty, reinventing itself whenever its survival was threatened. The perspective of a former Mexican security official, still in contact with figures inside the government, offered a chilling insight into the mindset of cartel operatives. He explained that many traffickers did not fear arrest or even extradition to the United States. In fact, some saw capture as a potential opportunity rather than a downfall. If they could bargain their way into the U.S. Federal Witness Protection Program, offering to betray old colleagues in exchange, the trade-off seemed worthwhile. For them, the promise of safety and continued financial gain outweighed the risks. This transactional view of loyalty, where betrayal became just another tool of survival, revealed the corrosive moral universe in which the cartels operated. The official described this entire cycle as a deeply toxic dynamic. Cartel members lived lives that were both perilous and profitable, constantly navigating between law enforcement pressure and new avenues for enrichment. Each crackdown seemed only to spur more innovation. Each arrest only reshuffled the power structure without eliminating it. For outsiders, the spectacle often resembled progress, but within the cartel world, it was simply another phase in a long-running game of adaptation. What emerged from these observations was a sobering truth. The cartels thrived because they were fluid, shifting strategies as effortlessly as water finding new paths through rock. Even when faced with international pressure, sanctions, and terrorism designations, they could bend without breaking. Their networks infiltrated legal markets, diversified into unexpected industries, and used both corruption and violence to ensure survival. For individuals ensnared in these networks, the line between crime and cooperation blurred into shades of gray, where betrayal could become a means of advancement. The cycle, described so vividly by those who studied it, proved the sheer complexity of dismantling such organizations. Fighting the cartels was never just about drugs, money, or even weapons. It was about confronting a culture of adaptability where power shifted hands but the machinery kept running. In the end, as the former official hinted, the toxicity lay not only in the violence and corruption, but also in the unsettling realization that the cartels had woven themselves into the fabric of both legal and illegal economies. Breaking that grip would require more than pressure or spectacle. It would demand strategies as inventive and relentless as the cartels themselves. Thanks for watching. Before you go, click the link on your screen to check out another video. See you there.